ontologically, from the biblical and Christian perspective, love is first and foremost one of the essential attributes of God. Love is ultimately a divine energy or power, which utterly uniquely, in the case of God, is perfectly actualized and fully operative from all eternity. So that actually, this relates to the point that you were making about how difficult it is to conceptualize, right, adequately what love is. Basically, the Christian tradition has always read Exodus 3:14 and 15, where God says to Moses, "I am who I am." The Christian tradition has understood that to be a statement that God is the only being, God is the perfect being, God is fully actualized in terms of all of God's attributes. And specifically, though, what's interesting is I thought about, okay, how does the Bible characterize God if God is love? 1 John 4:16. And what the Bible lays stress on is God's moral attributes. So again, what's utterly unique about God and distinguishes him from all the rest of finite contingent reality, which we are, is that all of God's attributes are eternally, fully realized, and they mutually co-inhere and are coextensive, to use a spatial metaphor. What this means is that all of the divine attributes or characteristics as we understand them, we are forced cognitively to think about each quality separately, but in God, they mutually co-inhere, they co-determine each other, they're compatible with each other, and they're inseparable. So that sounds really abstract. But if you look at Exodus 33, verses 12 and 13, when Moses boldly asks to see God's glory, God reframes the question altogether and says, "I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you." All of my goodness. And then the way that God actually describes himself initially is, he says, "I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." So the first thing that God says is characteristic, highlights about his goodness is his sovereignty and his absolute freedom to use his power and all of his capacities in any way that he chooses. And what's crucial is that God chooses to use all of his infinite power in a way that shows compassion and mercy for human beings. And then, relatedly, God emphasizes his holiness. "No one may see me and live." So already we have a definition, a beginning definition of God's goodness. And in particular, what's highlighted is his disposition to have mercy and compassion on human beings and his holiness. But then, as you know, in Exodus 34, 6 through 7, when God actually passes by Moses, we have an even fuller recital, which fills in the picture even more in terms of what does God's goodness consist in. His personal name is Yahweh, and God says he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving their wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generations. So all of this is highly significant because, again, we learn that God designates all of these qualities as constitutive of his goodness. His sovereignty and freedom of purposive will and action, which he exercises. He elects to exercise them on behalf of human beings and of his creation, of their good, of their well-being. Compassion, mercy, holiness, graciousness, showing forbearance towards sinners, his justice, which is not apathetic toward wrong, but he condemns and rectifies wrongdoing. So my point is that what God perfectly personifies and is always self-consistently doing is consistent with all of these characteristics. Again, that's not easy for us. And what I think is relevant is that we human beings, we're prone to think of and treat love of all kinds, love for people, love for God, love for things, should treat love as an end in itself, as a good in itself that is unqualified. If I love something, it needs no justification, no qualification whatsoever. In other words, we often treat love in isolation from the other attributes of God, from what is true and right, what is good about God himself and about all things in relationship to him. So there's kind of an inbuilt, part of what is confusing or complicates things for us is we have these inbuilt sort of cognitive limitations, but then, of course, living post-fall as we do and sharing in the common human predicament of alienation from God and ambivalence, even as we're being restored in Christ, we still feel ambivalent about God, what and his will. So I think that's one of the problems, and we're going to deal with that later. But so again, I think experientially we're prone to treat and pursue love as an ideal and as a good in and of itself, in isolation from God and the other qualities that define God's goodness. So we're often short-sighted. We're prone to trade in long-term goods in exchange for short-term gains and momentary satisfactions of our desires. The main point that I'm making here is that in order for our loves to be conducive to actual well-being and flourishing of human beings, love needs to be tested, it needs to be examined, it needs to be ordered and set aright. It needs to be coherent with the truth. It needs to be consistent with the truth, right? And with holiness and goodness and that sort of thing. So love and isolation, we can't help, thinking that way. And yet, from a biblical perspective, since God himself is love and is goodness, and goodness is the larger, morally good. So God's moral excellence consists of all those attributes. And for us, being made in the image of God and in the image of Christ, particularly, who is the true image of God, when we think about love from a biblical perspective, theological perspective, we need to have a more holistic understanding of what is good for human beings, from that perspective. And so, secondly, then love is, if it's ultimately a divine attribute, it's obviously human loves. Love and loves have their ultimate origin and ultimate goal and consummation in God. So the human capacity, the desire, the impulse, the drive to seek love, to give and receive love, is implanted in us by God himself. So God is love, and love comes from John, both affirmations from First John. The third point that I want to make, which lines up with what observations made already earlier, is that we need to speak about love in the plural. Not only is there God's love, but there are many human loves, and that's legitimate, obviously, because God himself created the cosmos with incredible, biodiversity. We read about that in Genesis 1 and that sort of thing. So everything that God created is good and is legitimately to be valued and loved.